I'll be honest, I wasn't expecting much from this acrylic painting. As an oil painter, I've always been a bit skeptical about acrylics, but what happened next has completely changed my perspective. So maybe it's time to give acrylic painting a second chance. So what I'm doing here is I decided that I would paint this river scene here. I really like the greens in the scene, and especially that transparent water where you can see the submerged rocks underneath. I was going to paint this in oils, but I thought, do you know what, let's try it in acrylics. A lot of my audience paint with acrylics, and whilst I mostly paint with oils, I did think maybe it's time to revisit acrylics and see what results I get. So what I'm doing here is I'm sketching out my composition, and I'm painting on a 12" by 16" wooden panel. I primed it with a few layers of acrylic gesso as well. I've painted on canvas in the past with acrylics and was never really that happy with the results. But I thought this time I would try painting on wood and see what it looks like. So what I'm doing here is I'm using burnt sienna to sketch out my composition using a number 5 Shiraz flat brush, and this is a synthetic brush. The main thing to do here is to outline my composition. I designed this in my sketchbook, and in fact here is the original sketch. This is something I'd always recommend you do. But the landscape here was already naturally forming a pretty good composition, so I didn't really change much. Once I'd outlined my composition, I began my painting. Now whenever I paint a landscape, I always start by painting the dark values first, and this sets a whole tonal structure for the scene and makes it a lot easier to paint the areas in light. So when looking at my reference photos, I was identifying where are the darkest shadows. Well, they're mainly in the rocks here with these occlusion shadows, and there's also some shadows along the banks of the river and in the trees. Now the inspiration for this painting came from a place in the lower North Island in New Zealand, and I took these photos in the morning when the sun was lower in the sky. Now to paint these darks here, I was using combinations of ultramarine blue with burnt sienna and a little alizarin crimson. And then for those lighter blues, I added a little titanium white to lighten the value. Now I'll just quickly go over the rules of the values that you'll see in the landscape. So value is how light or dark your subject is, and we'll find our darkest darks and our lightest lights in the foreground. Then as landforms recede, the darks aren't as dark and the lights aren't as light. So as I say, I'm just marking in where my main shadows are in this scene. Now this scene is mostly in light, so there's only just a few shadows, but having those few shadows is really important to creating a sense of depth and distance in this landscape painting. This works for any landscape paintings. Just having some shadows just helps to convey the depth within the scene, and I think makes it easier to paint. Now for this distant mountain here, I used a mix of ultramarine blue with some burnt sienna, titanium white and a little alizarin crimson. Now, one of the things that I've had issues with acrylics is the fact that they dry really quickly. But moving forward with these acrylic paintings, I decided to change the way I do a couple of things compared with the way I paint oils. Firstly, I decided I'm not going to use real strong detail in my paintings. I'm going to opt for more loose gestural brush marks. I keep in mind, obviously, that the paint dries quickly and dries darker, so I account for that as well. So I'm going to go for more loose painterly brush marks. The other thing I've been using is a wet palette, and that's made quite a significant difference because I don't have to worry about my paint drying on my palette really quickly, and that's helped with this painting here. So now that I got my darks in, I started with the vegetation and the grass in the background. I was using combinations of yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, ultramarine blue and titanium white as my base green. And then I was adding colours to it such as phthalo green or burnt sienna to help harmonise the green, as burnt sienna contains red and red is opposite to green on the colour wheel, and titanium white. I'm also keeping the values tonally darker at this stage, and then once dry I can add lighter colour to it. So we're going to find our most saturated colours in the foreground, so that's where our most saturated greens are going to be. So for this I use more cadmium yellow and phthalo green in my mix, but for those more distant greens I use less of these colours, but then more of the yellow ochre and titanium white. The other thing I do when I mix colour is I use broken colour, so I don't mix them all together thoroughly because I like to see some of those individual hues coming through on the paint. Now when painting the sky here, I use a mix of ultramarine blue with some titanium white and a little bit of phthalo green. And I'm making the value of the sky lighter near the horizon and darker as I move up the painting. Now I have to admit the paint was drying pretty quickly here, but I was just doing my best making solid bold brush marks in a downwards direction so you can still see the texture of the paint in the actual painting, the texture of my brush marks. I just think it makes it look more painterly and impressionistic, and as I say, that's what I'm going to go for moving forward with my acrylic paintings, because I do intend to do some more acrylics. However, I intend to make my acrylics more loose and gestural than compared with my oil paintings. Now whilst I was letting the background dry here, I was working on the reflective water. So what I've done already was to paint the vegetation that's being reflected using the same colours that I used for the vegetation. And then after that I painted the sky reflections using downwards brush marks. The next thing to do was to paint these submerged stones in the water. Now painting these isn't as difficult as you'd think. You just need to keep in mind that the value of these submerged stones and rocks is going to be darker than the stones that are above the water. So I use combinations of ultramarine blue with burnt sienna, titanium white, alizarin crimson and even a little yellow ochre, but generally keeping the mixes on the blue side. I then transitioned the stones more towards the tone of the water and the reflections where the sky is. It's not that difficult to do. For the stones that are above the water, I used a mix of yellow ochre, titanium white, a little burnt sienna and a little ultramarine blue. Then following this, I just decided to let them dry and begin working on the background again now that this is dry, just adding more details to those distant trees. And then also beginning to add some highlights to the vegetation that's in the foreground. And I was using a similar green mix that I was using in the beginning stages. So a mix of yellow ochre, ultramarine blue, cadmium yellow and titanium white as my base, and then using that phthalo green to really increase the saturation. I also used a little bit of cadmium red light as well, just to add a red element to the mix and make those greens look a lot more organic. Now then, everything was dry again at this point, so it was time to start building up the details, especially in the rocks here. So I was painting the submerged stones, just restating some of the shadows there. And again, mostly using mixes of ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, titanium white and alizarin crimson. It's really important to keep the shadows of the submerged stones more on the blue side as they're in water. Now then, I hope you're enjoying this video so far, and if you've been struggling with your landscape painting and would like a process so that you can accelerate your painting skills with my proven system, then check out my free landscape painting blueprint. Just click the link below and I'll send it over to you. Enjoy. Back to the painting, and I'm getting well into the adding detail phase. Although, as I said, this isn't going to be an overly detailed painting. It's more about just expressive brushwork and capturing the colours and the tonal values that are in the landscape. One of the things I did with the rocks that are on the side of the riverbank was to start painting in some of those halftones. Again, using ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, titanium white and a little alizarin crimson. Now you may notice some of these common colour mixes that I've been using, and the main reason for this is when we're using common colours throughout the painting, it means we're much more likely to get a nice harmonious looking painting in terms of colour, which means your painting will just read well to the viewer and it will look really nice. I find it easier to use fewer colours, and to paint this artwork here I only had 8 colours on my palette including titanium white. Now that everything was dry again, I started to paint lighter tones on the rocks by the side of the riverbank here. So just like with my oil paintings, I start off with my paintings tonally darker so that I have plenty of room to build up the lighter tones as I work through the painting, and this is just going to convey much more depth in your painting and make it look more realistic, more three-dimensional. If we go too light to start with, we're just going to have nowhere else to go if we wanted to go even lighter, because the lightest we can go is white, and you may end up with a flat looking painting. So best to keep everything tonally darker to start with, even when you're painting in acrylics, and then build up those lighter layers of paint. Now at this point in the painting, I was starting to work on various zones and just tidy up forms, re-emphasize some of these reflections from the trees that are in the midground, tidy up some of the shadows, restate some dark values. And I have to say, I was having quite a lot of fun painting this. I have been very pleasantly surprised, as some of the acrylic paintings that I did last year I found a little tricky. However, I found that painting on a wooden panel and using a wet palette has made a huge difference. So I think I will be doing a few more of these acrylic paintings on this channel. So what I'm doing here is I'm now adding lighter tone to some of these distant trees, painting reflected light in the bank of this river here, and generally adding more detail. So for example, there's some rocks here in the midground, and now that everything's dry, I was able to just quickly paint those in with a number 3 synthetic Shiraz brush, a flat brush. I've just used flat brushes for this whole painting, apart from some of the foliage where I used a rigger brush. And I'm definitely in the fun part of the painting here, where I can just add little bits of detail here and there. And because of the quick drying time, it doesn't take long for me to paint some of these details, just quickly let it dry and then be able to go back to it. That is one of the advantages of painting with acrylics, as they dry very quickly. So the next thing I needed to do here was just define more where the river sort of moves into the distance, and there was a little bit of more rapid moving water, so I just painted some white tones on there, mainly just titanium white with a little bit of yellow ochre, just to convey some more rapidly moving water. And then once again it was to the dry foreground, and where I was just restating some of these occlusion shadows in the rocks, just adding more definition to some of them. I actually found in some ways the rocks were a little easier to paint with acrylics than with oils, so that was interesting. And here I was just painting some highlights on these distant rocks. By this point the painting was pretty much finished. So I have to say, I really did enjoy painting this, and it's making me rethink acrylics altogether. I know that some of my audience do paint with acrylics, so let me know in the comment section if you'd like me to do more of these acrylic landscape paintings, as well as the usual oil paintings that I upload to this channel, which is just as applicable to acrylic painting anyway. This channel is all about landscape painting. Now, if you like this painting, it's available for sale on my website at samuelerfineart.com. I also have loads of other paintings for sale and prints as well, so check that out. The link is in the description box below. If you'd like to learn more about painting water, then check out this video here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.